The focus of this session is not on the technical nuts and bolts of DEI&B, but it's more about the human side. It's more about what happens between us as human beings in relation to DEI&B. And what we really are aiming at is how do we strengthen the relational intelligence to be able to initiate and sustain those DEI&B conversations. And as I said also in that video clip, it's about sharing some key principles and skills, to help you, to empower you as an individual and ultimately as an organization to navigate your DEI&B conversations. And just to get us started, I know that we have different languaging of the DEI&B acronym, different organizations. So maybe let's just get a window into the world that we are operating from. What is the language, or what is the acronym that you are using in your organization? So maybe in the chat box, just put the acronym. What is the languaging within your own organization, just so we get a lay of the land. DIBS, that's the one. Yeah, DEI. DSR. Aha, that's the first. Dismantling structural racism. Brilliant, brilliant. I love that, Zanele, because it talks to the fact that we may, dismantle racism at one level, but there are structural residue and historical residue to racism. Fantastic. DEI&B or transformation. Fantastic. We are early days of DEI&B, so we're just going at DB&I, absolutely. And this all talks about the fact that this is an evolving landscape with a history, that dates back, if we look at it from the American context, the 1960s, the civil rights movement, and equally in South Africa, the 1960s was an equally quite a volatile period in our socio-political history. And as we know that organizations are microcosms of the larger social context, there's always a spillover in terms of what happens in the macro context into the organization. And that is always evolving. And therefore, even the language and initiatives within the corporate space are constantly changing. Transformation, DEI, D&I, Sinazo. Thank you so much for that. So I suspect that you will appreciate with me that there is a lot of complexity. And I think if you went into a dictionary, any dictionary, and looked up each of these words, or even if you went academic and did a literature review on any of these words, you would find quite a lot of literature in terms of definitions and meanings. And so this is quite a complex picture that we are working with. So what we're going to do, just from a point of view of having a common platform and a common language and a point of reference, this is going to be kind of our working definition of the DEI and B environment. So the first one is diversity. And diversity talks to the fact that although we obviously as the human community have a lot in common, there are equally important ways in which we differ. Hence, we are diverse and the diversity thereof. The point, however, is that diversity historically has been used as a way to either favor certain people and, on the other hand, to discriminate against other people. And hence, it then takes us to the second element around equity, not to be confused with equality. Equity says we recognize where we come from, and we recognize that there has been an unfair advantaging or disadvantaging and marginalization of certain people. Equity says, how do we level the playing field? How do we move from unfair disadvantage to parity? And equality, on the other hand, is a flight that moves us from acknowledging that, yes, there has been disadvantage and discrimination. And then it says, okay, let's move. We are now all equal. All the discriminatory policies and practices have been eliminated. We are now all equal, which is, what we would refer to as the flight to health, because it is not realistic. Because essentially you can't have people that metaphorically have had their hands tied to their backs, and now and some people have been advancing while those have had their hands tied to their backs, and then you suddenly say, okay, now I've removed all the shackles, we are all equal, let's all move. It is an unrealistic picture. So Parity says, what measures do we need to put in place to mitigate or ameliorate that distance that has been created across time? And then the next one, inclusion. And I love the circle, you know, because it's saying, let's broaden, let's make the circle bigger, as we often say. Let's broaden the circle and make sure that there is enough room on the table, on the banquet of participation and access to resources and opportunities to accommodate the diversity, and to take into consideration that there are equity measures that have to be put in place to expand that space for everyone. And the last one moves more into the internal landscape, in that it's saying the longing to belong is one of our fundamental human needs, to be a part of a tribe, because that confers not just physical, but psychological and emotional safety. And so the challenge has been that as this landscape has evolved historically, we have moved from recognizing that, oh, this picture lacks color, it lacks texture in many ways. And so we said, okay, let's get the right people. Let's be inclusive. Let's get the right people. And the numbers look great if we look at it from that element. But what have we done to make sure that the people are brought in feel an integral part of the process, feel not just included by virtue of, yes, you're here, but how do you feel safe enough to bring yourself fully to this space and be an integral part of what's going on? So those are the fundamental dynamics. And I don't want to go too much into the technicalities, but it's also important to angle ourselves in terms of the space that we are looking at. So against that background, I'm now going to invite you to reflect on your own situation. Where are you in terms of your own organization? As we enter the 2nd of February in 2024, what are the challenges that you are navigating in your organization in relation to DEI&B? And we're going to do this in terms of a poll, and there are 10 challenges that have been identified there. And what I would like you to do in the chat box, I'm going to launch the poll shortly. In the chat box, give us your top 3. What keeps you, perhaps as an individual, and even more importantly, in relation to DEI&B in your organization? What keeps you awake? What is the burning platform in terms of your top 3 issues? And so I'm opening the poll, and we'll allow everybody to have a look at the different ones and choose your top 3. I've launched it, so you should be able to access it, and we'll be able to see how the needle of your top 3 challenges moves as we go. So let's see, 14 or 21. Yeah, lack of psychological safety. 14, discussions are mainly framed around race and gender. Aha, it's an important one as well in terms of how we understand that landscape. At 14%, discussions are mainly framed around the 2, race and gender. I guess those are the most obvious ones and visible ones for us to see. And so that's where we are most likely to go. So that gives us a good indication of where the major challenges are. And I suspect that it is only because we have said, what are your top 3? But if we really want to look at each one of them, each one of them is a top challenge in its own right, you know, and we can't actually really have those conversations without considering each one of them. The big question, however, is how many of these challenges, whether your top 3 or your 10th one, even your last one, how many of them would you be able to solve or to deal with without talking about them? Is there a single one that does not require us to engage each other and engage effectively to be able to move forward regarding that dynamic? I suspect none, right? And so it then suggests that our relational intelligence becomes so much more important, because even if we can have the technicalities and, you know, we can have, for example, intervention perhaps from government that says, here are the quotas, this is what you must comply with. Even at that, we still need to engage with each other. Then, as we say, dialogue becomes your make or break of those DEI&B conversations. And I'm sure that as we think about each one of them, you will agree that these are by no means casual conversations. They are at a different level. And because here's the thing, we are all geniuses at casual conversations. It's a walk in the park. We're all smart at it. It is at crucial conversations where we really get stuck. And this is where the relational intelligence becomes the make or break of those conversations. And I love the you know, even just the triangle, the image of crucial conversations. It shows the triangle. And if we think about it from road signs perspective, do you remember those days when we did our driver's license and we were learning to drive and we were holding on to that steering wheel for dear life? And it was like everything in that moment, right? What did that triangle, whenever we saw a triangle, what was the first thing that came to mind? What did we have to do? Perhaps in the chat box, what popped up? If you can think back, is it that far back? Whenever we saw a triangle, what did it say? Caution, absolutely. Aha, yield, indeed, right? In other words, it is not business as usual. Right? And in some places they say, you know, give way to another. Be cautious. There is danger, right? There is potential for things to go out of hand. Triangle told me that something is coming. And if we don't, you know, yield to that or be cautious, things are bound to get out of hand. It is a danger point, absolutely. And so that is the essence of crucial conversations. They are risky and sensitive by nature. And therefore, because they are risky and sensitive by nature, we are most likely to firstly rather not go there. You know, we rather not go there and let sleeping dogs lie and hope that if we avoid talking about them, they will go away. And the reality, as we all know, is that avoiding an issue doesn't make it go away. But like a cancer, it starts to metastasize and it spreads insidiously and begins to contaminate all other things. So avoiding is not a solution. Or we fumble our way, and for the most part, we succeed without even knowing. It's like, oh, thank goodness. You know, I don't even know how we got through this, but we survived, right? And so it is not in our nature as human beings to survive. We are designed to thrive. And that's what we want to do. Relational intelligence is about how do we make the most of these risky and sensitive conversations. And so the elements of a crucial conversations are, firstly, it's that it's about high stakes. And I suspect you'll agree with me that each of those 10 items are not, well, it's okay sort of things, right? Great if I get it, great if we don't, and it's the same, blah, 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 right? It's things that matter. It is, there's risk to it in that there's a lot to lose, but equally so, there's a lot at stake if we don't get it right. And the second element says we are in opposing opinions. And this is when we are polarized in where we stand, which often happens, and specifically around these issues, we are most likely to be, it's either going to be your way or my way. And these are the times when we want our way the most, because these are high stakes issues, right? It matters. And you at that time are gunning and all guns blazing, you know, in order to get your way. And what it does is that it positions us in terms of win, lose, top dog, underdog, my way, not your way. And when that happens, within us as human beings, we are wired for survival. The self feels threatened when something that important to me is being compromised and there isn't room for it. And therefore, it then triggers our reptilian brain, our reptilian defense mechanisms, the 3S of fight, flight, and freeze. And what that means is that at the time when we need our relational intelligence, that's when we don't have it the most. And therefore, there's only one way that things are bound to go, and it's downhill, right? Because we get lit with strong emotions. we get hot under the collar. How dare you not see my point of view? Of course I'm right and you are wrong, right? And that's when things are likely to get out of hand. And hence, it becomes very important to, be able to leverage the principles and skills that we are going to share. And these are, categories, everyday categories of crucial conversations or challenging conversations. And I'm going to take a bottom-up approach in saying that the bottom four, which is ageism, homophobia, sexism, and racism, and I would add ableism, those are what we would regard as the macro aggressions and macro iniquities, because all of us are kind of familiar with those. And that's our first kind of port of call, racism, and particularly in South Africa, that was the one, that defined people a lot, and sexism, the gender issues, and as we evolve as a society, we are seeing more considerations around the LGBTIQ community as well, and ableism as opposed to people with disabilities, and of course, for OJ and myself, ageism, the gray hair people, ableism. So importantly, and this is an unfamiliar language to most of us, starting with myself, and let's look at what is the definition of microaggressions and micro iniquities without getting too technical about it. And so I'm going to borrow from a prolific psychologist and advocate, Prof. Kevin Nadal, who is very much, around issues on how microaggressions affect people of ethnic and racial minorities, as well as the LGBTIQ community. And he describes microaggressions as the everyday, subtle, intended, but sometimes inadvertent behaviors that we engage in terms of what we say, the comments that we have, or the things that we do in terms of our behaviors and how we interact with people. And the thing about them is that they communicate some sort of bias, specifically around those groups of people that, as we know, we are a history or historied people. We don't just emerge today. We have a whole history that, we drag with us as the invisible suitcase. So of people that not only have been discriminated against, but people that have been, marginalized and peripheralized in society. So there is the core, the center, and the periphery. And the peripheral, the core discourse is the one that, really society operates on at the expense of the marginalized societies. And the thing about it is that, the words microaggressions and micro-iniquities are often used interchangeably because ultimately they are all playing within the same space. And the thing about it is that they are rooted in implicit bias. And all of us sit in our blind spot in one way or another. Just by virtue of the fact that if you stand in one place, you are not in another. If you are this type of person, you are not the other. And therefore, it is built in to who we are. And the quicker we can acknowledge it, the more we can work effectively with it so that we expand that zone and minimize the blind spot and maximize our consciousness in terms of how we engage. So because these actions, microaggressions, are rooted in implicit bias, people are often unaware that they are committing them. And they may often feel like they're expressing an interest or curiosity, and it's okay. I don't know if any of you have watched on Netflix something called a series called The Trust. And it's so interesting that I was watching this week on episode 3, and there was this girl originally from Nigeria. I think she went to the US at a very young age, and she's part of this. I think there's 10 of them. And the one guy, I think, coming from a good place, as he said, to express an interest and appreciation and curiosity, kept referring to her as the African queen. Oh, you are this black, or you are this African, this and then the other. And she made the comment that it's making me feel out of place, because it's as though you can only see me as this African queen. And even though you're putting me on this pedestal, there's a way in which I feel that it's as though you don't recognize me as part of the core of the population, but you see me as a special feature on this, which makes me feel I'm being othered in a sense, and I'm being pushed to the periphery. And, you know, there are different ways in which microaggressions play out. Examples of verbal microaggressions. Oh, asking people in the LGBTQ IQ community, so who's the man in the relationship? You know, mispronouncing somebody's name because it's just too much effort for you to try and learn their name. And linked to that, can I call you? Can I rather conveniently call you this? And I had experience of that myself, because, you know, in the Black community, we generally say, you have a home name, and my home name is Khosi. And then we have a school name, and my school name was Sibongiseni. And at school, one of my teachers felt it was just too much effort to learn pronouncing my name and wanted to offer me an English name that would be convenient for him. And of course, my natural response was that I wasn't born pronouncing your name. I had to learn. I had to make an effort. So do the same. Learn it. There's enough time. We're going to be here for 5 years. You will learn how to pronounce my name. And also, you know, it's much easier for me to call you Mr. Shajwayo than it is to call you by your English surname. So, you know, it works on both sides. And the other thing that does get to me, of course, is when we as Black people choose to use English names when you have an African name. And because when I ask people, because this is an issue for me, this is my bias, people would say, oh no, white people can't pronounce it. And my answer is, so what? Don't deprive them of the opportunity to learn. Do you think they are incapable of learning? Let them learn. You also had to learn their name, right? Okay, sure. Let me keep it moving. Yeah, and continue to use words or phrases that others find offensive. And, you know, part of the thing when people ask me, what's your English name? Or what's your Christian name? And my question becomes, what's not Christian about my names? You know, and we come from a history where people went to apply for their dompas, and they would say, no, that thing is nonsense. This is your name now. Andries, this is your name. You know, people have come home with new names that their parents didn't give them. All the beauty of where we come from, our history. Some of the example, that's such a gay thing to do. Oh, you are one of the good people. You are not like them. Or expressions such as, oh, you people, you know, and you're being a bit OCD about this. Or people say, oh, you're so bipolar, you know, throwing these names or terms that have very serious and deep implications about what you're saying about a person, or even saying about yourself, because those are not, you know, labels that we should throw up about lightly. And I have never known that you are disabled, as opposed to you have a disability, for example. Because a disability is not something that they are, but it's something that they have. And when I was working at one of the psychiatric hospitals, one girl came rushing to me to greet me. And so I greet her and I say, oh, okay, so what's your name? And she says, I am BMD. And I stand there trying to think, I'm BMD. What does that mean? And she says, I'm bipolar mood disorder. And, you know, it's like, no, you are, what is your name? That's who you are. You're a human being with a name. You have bipolar mood disorder. You are not that disorder. You are not your condition. Excluding people with a disability from after work events, because we assume that they are incapable of, you know, getting there and participating in those. Ageism, assuming an older co-worker such as myself is unable to learn to use technology. In my case, it is true. I have to confess. And that's why I need Kelly. I have needed Kelly when we went into lockdown and had to migrate to online training. Woo, I cannot tell you. And this year, Kelly, my technology coach, told me, Khosi, this year, let me tell you, the poll, it's the first time I've launched a poll myself. So it's an accomplishment. Thank you. So there's hope for all of us. Agter ons kom ook in die kraal. And that one, can I touch your hair, which I find quite hilarious, because I remember when I went to Malaysia in 1998, and with a Rotary exchange program for 8 weeks, and we traveled to places where, was told it's the first time that people actually see a Black person, and people would creep up behind me and just like touch my hand, run away, and I would stop and say, no, come and touch it, it's fine, come and touch it. Or even today, people still ask, can I touch your hair, is that real, and so on. Or people talk about the gray hair. Some people say, oh, that's beautiful, while others come to me and say, oh, I'm so sorry that you've got gray hair. Don't worry, you don't look old at all. And the question becomes, do I look worried? And do you think it's the first time that I'm noticing that I've got gray hair? So it's all those weird and wonderful things, ways in which we are with each other. So those were the behavioral ones. Environmental microaggressions are those that are structural, to Zanele's point earlier on, that are expressed in society through a lack of representation, inclusion, and diversity. And the structural issues are examples are excluding from a racial or gender perspective people from higher echelons of organizations, and the discrimination or inconsideration around accessibility to facilities, naming buildings or meeting rooms and so on in companies after just white men, and not establishing any protocol for sharing gender pronouns, which is very interesting, because I noticed recently that people put it even in their signature. And I thought, wow, okay, so it's interesting how, the ground is shifting in terms of how we begin to refer to ourselves. And what I've also found interesting, because we actually had a conversation around one of our December gatherings around gender pronouns, to say that in English, you have gender pronouns, but in African languages, there aren't any gender pronouns. So who do you become then? How do we navigate that? Yebo?
Sorry, I just want to direct your attention to the chat box. We've got some comments coming through. So Marita also saying, my daughter hates the can I touch your hair, as she has a different threat to my other daughters and I. And Chanya is saying that she can relate to that. Nana saying vulnerability is extremely key in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, in as much as maturity to deal with our unique and necessary differences. And then we've got a question coming from Nicole saying she's going to say the unpopular thing in the conversation like this one. Has the world not just become hypersensitive? So I don't know what you have to say about that.
Yeah, very important and very interesting considerations. Thank you very much. As I was saying, there isn't a firm ground to stand on, and there isn't a one size fits all, because as we've said, I don't mind. In fact, for me, I just find it hilarious. But for some people, it's a touchy issue. And that is why we need the relational intelligence to be able to walk this path and know how to deal with those different nuances and sensitivities. And I think it's so important, the word, to balance our vulnerability, to even admit that, look, I'm not even sure what's going on. I mean, I've said at a point, it's like, okay, LGBTQI, where and what's the difference? And I sit down and can you just talk me through what's going on here? And I often ask myself, oh my goodness, how much capacity do I have to take on another one? And what does it mean? On one hand, have we become so permissive that anything and everything goes? Or have we become so hypersensitive? Very valid question, Nicole. Have we become so hypersensitive that everything is, a potential landmine that we step on? And I think my thinking is that as a society, we kind of struggle to find some middle ground. And again, even as I say middle ground, whose middle are we talking about? And so we move from polar opposites. And as we move, we kind of move from not having to having everything, sort of thing. And it becomes a challenge. And the challenge, of course, is how do we have these conversations? How do we become vulnerable enough to say, look, I don't know, or I'm just as scared. I'm just as confused, and I might just fumble at this. But let's rather fumble together. And please, can we give each other the patience, the understanding that this is unknown territory and this is risky and sensitive territory? Can we just be patient with ourselves and each other as we have these conversations? So great. Thank you, Kelly. You see why I need Kelly here? Right. So the next one is micro iniquities, which was coined by Professor Mary Rowe, who is, a professor focusing on negotiation and conflict resolution. And she says that micro iniquities are apparently or seemingly small events, which are often ephemeral, passing, and very subtle and hard to prove behaviors or events that are often unintentional. Again, that implicit bias that people, we infrequently recognize that they are offensive to people that we perceive to be different. So again, it's a form of othering and relegating people to a certain corner of society from the core. And it could be a comment, a gesture, a specific words, a tone of voice that demeans, discourages, devalues, or marginalizes the recipient, often subtle, is singled out, overlooked due to their membership of a particular group that we perhaps want to relegate to the fringes. It can often be dismissed and people can kind of laugh it off and play it down. And I remember, as I'm thinking about this, my nephew would whenever he wanted to get out of his chores of washing the dishes, he would say to his older sister, okay, Ndimenhle, I don't want to disempower you as a woman. Go and wash dishes. I don't want to be accused of disempowering you. Go and wash dishes. Of course, it never worked. But these are the sorts of things that can slide easily through. And before we know it, they've sort of become part of our language. And the thing about them is that it makes people feel unwelcome, unsupported, marginalized, and made invisible in the common space that we all call our work. Different examples: disregarding, constantly forgetting to pronounce. I think we've said some of this. Mansplaining or mentorrupting. Nicole, how about that? When everything gets explained through the lens of a man. And there's also, I remember when I was reading for my PhD, there was an article around history is about his story. And how do we shift towards her story instead of history? So we are living in interesting times, aren't we? Just rolling eyes when somebody's talking specifically from the point of view, and it's not just rolling eyes, but rolling eyes because of, you regard them as a member of a different groups. And I'm looking at the time, so I don't want to really get too caught up in the categories, but suffice to say, there's quite a wide landscape. And of course, as we say, organizations are microcosms of what happens in the broader social landscape. So these things, are the suitcase that we bring with us to work, and they play out in our everyday interactions with each other. They play out also in terms of hiring practices. And there's one study that actually, they proved how, for example, there's a difference in when there's a name to a person's CV, and how the same CV, just because it had a name or a certain name, was not pushed aside. But when it had a different name, same details, everything was different. How people, the biases that filter in terms of who is given access to an opportunity, whose foot, gets put in the door of organizations, advancement and recognition. And, we tend to gravitate to whatever is similar to us. And it takes a lot more effort to challenge ourselves to bring in that inclusivity of people that come from a different, community, mentorship and sponsorship opportunities. I remember with one of the clients, there was a discussion around, how easy it is for the organization, and kind of without even thinking, to sponsor, for example, rugby. But when there was a major soccer thing going on, nobody thought to, actually, what effort can we make to honor that as well? workplace norms and expectations. One of the conversations was around, it's great that there's a Christmas party, but not everybody is Christian. So, you know, what do we say about all the others that are being excluded from those? And of course, you know, these are labeled individually, but we know that there is intersectionality amongst them, that they cross-pollinate each other. And so what is relational intelligence? Relational intelligence says it's not anything goes. It is because these are risky and sensitive conversations. We've got to be conscious and apply ourselves conscientiously in terms of how we navigate the territory. And this is the model for navigating DEI&B conversations, as we identified what the 3 elements of a crucial conversation are. And that, you know, there are 3 major parts to the model. It says, what happens before we even open our mouths? And the essence of those first 2 principles says, what's the work I need to do with and within myself to ready myself to be able to, on the one hand, express myself, in other words, advocate for my opinion, but equally be able to listen and hear the other person and bring them in, because dialogue is about the back and forth, the to and fro, the reciprocity of communication, so that together we build, you know, and expand our shared understanding with each other, all of which is about then what do we do thereafter. And each one of these, what we see here are the 9 principles of holding crucial conversations. And for each principle, there are skills that we unpack, and I will share a few of those shortly. Most important is that when we face crucial conversations, in other words, when we are in opposing opinions about high stakes issues such as DEI&B, hopefully we don't feel physically unsafe or physically threatened, but in some instances that may also happen. But we definitely feel psychologically and emotionally unsafe. The self of us feels threatened in some ways when there's a risk of opposing opinions. And what do we say about opinions? They're like belly buttons, everybody's got one. But the problem is when I think mine is the only one that has room on the table of considerations and not yours. So how do we create the safety? How do we create an environment that's conducive to us holding these conversations and holding them effectively? Joseph Graney, one of the co-founders of Crucial Learning, says the most important thing we need to do is to reduce or eliminate the possibility of us offending someone, either inadvertently, deliberately or inadvertently. And here's the thing, we are all perfectly imperfect. We will offend somebody. It is, how do we become conscious and minimize that? And when we have, what are the skills that we have at our disposal to repair that offense? Because when that has happened, it means there's a crack in that relationship. How do we put relational intelligence is about how do we put that polyfiller so that the other person doesn't have to become defensive, but they can join us and engage in healthy conversation. One of the principles says, before we open our mouths, we've got to master our stories. Because it comes down to this, if we don't master your stories will master you. Because you're either a master or the opposite, the slave to your stories. And so how do we do that? And what does that talk to? It says our behavior, our actions are never just random. There's a logic. We say human beings are teleological. They are driven by purpose, right? We're never just random, even though our behaviors look illogical in the moment. But the path to our behavior or action is that it starts with something that we see or hear. Somebody will be doing something or they will be saying something. Based on that, we will then tell ourselves a story. That story, however, then generates, stirs, triggers certain feelings in us, and we act based on how we are feeling in the moment. An example being an associate or a colleague expresses their disagreement with how the company has been vocal about increasing the representation of whatever form, women, people with abilities, and so on, to higher levels, including the executive level. When we would hear somebody saying that, invariably we're going to tell ourselves a story about it. And I can only imagine what would be going on in your heads. But in the interest of time, we'll just move along. And one of the things is this person is a jerk, or they are a this, a that, and the other, all sorts of labels that we can throw at them. And based on that label or story that we have told ourselves, as we said, it will trigger certain emotions in us. And what we are most likely to feel: hurt, defensive, angry, offended, disgusted, and so on. The list goes on. And if that's how we are feeling, that's exactly how we are going to, where we are going to act from. That's what our behavior is going to reflect in that moment. And the thing about it, as we said, is that there is a key, the master key to understanding human behavior. First one says we guess. When there is a vacuum of information, we are not sure, why is this person saying this? Why is this person behaving like this? When we don't take the opportunity to ask, there's a principle that says nature abhors a vacuum. When there's that vacuum, nature will find a way to fill it up. And those are the stories that we're going to add, multiply, divide, drag our own stories and so on into making sense of this behavior. And this happens so quickly, most of the time we don't even recognize it's going on. It's the behind the scenes. And that's when we are most likely to become our own and other people's worst enemy. Because there's a domino effect in the sense that the more negative a story you have told, the more negative the emotions are going to be, and therefore invariably the behavior or your reaction to that situation. And that has been proven. Here's an interesting project, Implicit. They have an assessment, they call it IAT, Implicit Association Test. It's an assessment, not a test as such. But what they found in this, and you can actually go in and take one, it checks different categories of biases that we have, or associations, and it's about what comes to mind immediately when you see this, when you see that, what's our immediate association. And they found that 76% of people readily or almost immediately associate males with career and females with family. 70% associate male with science and females with the arts. 75% preference for white people over black people, and 35% a strong preference, only 35, for able-bodied people. So 35% of us have a strong preference for able-bodied people. That seems to suggest the opposite, only 35. So the majority have a preference for able people, and the majority have a bias towards people with disabilities. And this is the quality of stories that we tend to tell. The first one, the victim story, is the story we tell ourselves about ourselves in that interaction in relation, in this case, to DEI&B. The important equally is the story we tell ourselves about the other person. We see ourselves as victims, helpless, and the other person as the monster and the villain. How dare they? How can they even think of this? And when we see ourselves as victims, we see ourselves as helpless to do anything about it. And what we are saying through these principles and skills is, how do we transcend that? And it is about, instead of locking in to our stories, our immediate stories, to open our minds by asking this open-ended question, and rather become curious than close-minded and fixed in terms of saying, I wonder what would make this person do this or say this, right? Invite yourself into their world in order to understand where they are coming from. I had the privilege of, at one of the conferences in the US, listening to Daryl Davis talking about how that principle or that skill of why would a reasonable, rational, and decent person plays out, and how he has made it a mission of his life in the last 30 years. And his talk was actually titled A Black Man's Crucial Conversation with the Ku Klux Klan. And it is about him, going to a club and playing at a club. He's a prolific player, has played with the world's greats. And one white guy came and talked to him and said, why do you play like Jerry Lee Lewis, who's a white pianist, I think, rock and roll player. And Daryl's answer was, where do you think Jerry Lee Lewis learned from? you know, and this guy said, no, he invented this and it wasn't true. And how many things have been relegated to the core and stripped out, and I won't go there. So, and it turns out that this same guy then, as they continue to talk, this guy says to him, it's my first time that I'm having a conversation with a Black person. And as they continued to talk, it turned out that this guy was the head of the Ku Klux Klan. And as they continued to talk, they developed such a relationship that, as Daryl says, talk to somebody for 5 minutes and you will find something in common with them. Whereas we tend to see each other as different. And he said, talk to them some more, and that space of common ground grows. And so I'm going to ask Kelly if you can put, for those that are interested, there is a link and you can hear to the video where he talks about his experience. And to date, he's collected in excess of 200, what do you call them, gowns that the Ku Klux Klan wear because of the engagement that they've had with him, and they have denounced their Ku Klux Klanship and have given, so he collects these gowns as mementos to that journey. And this is about the trinity of positive regard for ourselves and each other. And it is about, if we come from positive thoughts, that is what we will express in our speech and our actions. And that's what we need to do. The most of Emily Gregory, who is a co-author at Crucial Learning, says we don't always necessarily agree with each other. However, in all thy getting, get understanding. That is always possible. And that's what we are aiming for with our relational intelligence. And here's a snippet of the principles and skills that we can draw from in order to maximize our DEI&B conversation. The first one says, do your checkup from your neck down. And it is about, what do you really want out of this conversation in your heart of hearts? And it is about the fact that many a times there is dissonance between what we say we really want in our heart of hearts and how we are behaving in that moment. So it's about doing that introspection that says, what does it look like I want based on my behavior right now? And it's the stock take of saying, what do I actually really want? Not just for myself, but to regard with the other person with the same regard I have for myself, for them as well, for the relationship, for the organization, and that can continue to reverberate to the broader social context of society and our communities. And then that says, if that's what I really want for all these different levels, how do we need to behave in a manner that's congruent with the results that we want? The second skill is about balancing the advocacy in terms of what we want with bringing the other person also on board, exploring, understanding where they are coming from. And the skill set is what we refer to as amplified listening skills. When we ask, if we want to know something, don't assume, ask. And then there are 3 additional skills that help us to really just, reflect and just scratch beyond the surface and deepen our understanding of the other person, to ask with the intent to understand rather than to react or respond. So the advocacy, it is about start with facts. Why? It's because facts are persuasive. They are least insulting or least likely to cause offense. It's easier to agree on facts. And thirdly, they build a foundation from which we can work once we have agreed on the facts. For example, you said it 3 times. No, I didn't say it 3 times. I said it on this day and on this day. It's actually twice. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. All right. Then we can move on from there. We're on a common page. Story is about the fact that whenever, as we say, nature abhors a vacuum. Whenever we see or hear something, invariably, we're going to try to make sense of it. So it is about checking in. What is the story that you have told yourself, about the person, about the situation? In this case, DEI&B issues. And it says here that the measure of a good question is the degree to which it invites indifference. For a moment, I thought, what are we saying here? And it's about how does it enable us to remain neutral, to stay in dialogue with each other, rather than to flee into various forms of self-defense mechanism, the fight, flight, or freeze. How do we stay in dialogue with each other and ask open-ended questions that enable us to do that? And that is what enables us to create and foster a speak-up culture that fosters, inclusivity and a sense of belonging. And, this quote says, a speak-up culture is an environment where everyone feels heard and valued, not just seen, but also heard, regardless, or rather not discriminated or dismissed on the basis of any of these characteristics or categories. And by encouraging and open communicating and active listening, the culture paves the way for diverse perspectives to be shared and respected. And when this happens, inclusivity and belonging become the inevitable, benefits that we reap individually and as an organization. It strengthens relationship. It helps us to build trust, which is our most fickle relational currency, hardest to earn and easiest to lose. How do we nurture and build that trust with each other? Improves employee well-being and improves and drives our innovation and creativity. And it helps us to, as quickly as possible, identify and surface and deal with issues, because we always say the measure of the quality of relationship is reflected in the time lag between when you identify an issue and when you talk about it and talk about it effectively. And so that was really less than half a miniskirt of the key principles and skills that I wanted to share with you on how to initiate and sustain your DEI&B conversations in your organizations. And we have 3 minutes to it, and they're open to questions and comments. And if there's anything